Good evening, everyone. My name is Steph Manette, and on behalf of the Bookshelf and Cormorant Books, I'd love to welcome everyone here to the launch of Stephen Henighan's The World After. We are going to have a delightful conversation this evening between Stephen and Diane Nalini, who's joining us. The format is very simple. They'll be conversing on some topics that are kind of a prearranged Q&A for the duration of approximately 30 minutes. And if you have questions as they go, please feel free to add things during the chat. There's going to be a running chat line along the side there, and you can just include anything that you'd like to ask Stephen during the course of the evening, and he will get to those questions at the end of the original Q&A. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Mark Cote, who is the publisher of Cormorant Books, as well as the editor of The World After. Thank you so much for everyone joining us, and welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Stephanie. And this is the point where if we were in the world of normal, I'd be pointing to parts of the bookshelf and commenting how the bookshelf is not just a bookstore, it is a cultural center and very much a part of Guelph. And I would comment on how just recently we learned that the majority of Canadian authored books are sold through the independent bookstores. And it's a significant number. And it means that Canadian authored books and Canadian published books get attention from booksellers like Stephanie and her staff, and they make a point of selling our books to the customers and bringing them to our customers, to their customers' attentions. And we value this a lot at Cormorant and throughout the industry. It's we really appreciate the work that people like the bookshelf put into selling good books. Well, speaking of good books, Stephen Henighan is the author of The World After and 5 other novels, 4 collections of short stories, and 4 books of essays. His work has been published in Plowshares. I believe, Stephen, you're one of 3 or 4 Canadian short story writers who've been published in Plowshares. 2 of the others are, I guess, we hope people have heard of Alice Munro and Mavis Gallant. So it's a pretty good company. He's also had opinion pieces published in the Globe and Mail, Geist magazine, and The Walrus, just to name a few. He has translated novels into English from Portuguese and Romanian. And he is the general editor of the Biblioasis International Translation Series. He is currently a professor of Spanish and Hispanic Studies at the University of Guelph. Diane Nalini is an award-winning jazz singer and songwriter who's performed at jazz festivals around the world and given gala performances for Bill Clinton and Sir Paul McCartney. Diane's original songs have been featured in films, television shows, and video games. She received her doctorate from the University of Oxford, where she studied on a Rhodes Scholarship, just like Bill Clinton. After 5 years on faculty at the University of Guelph's physics department, she joined the Federal Public Service, where she works in climate and air pollution policy. Those are the introductions that matter for now. I'm going to mute my mic and turn off my video, and I leave it to Diane and Stephen.
Thank you so much, Mark. Stephen, it's great to be here with you celebrating the launch of your new book. I loved this book, and I know we're gonna have fun talking about it. But before we do, just to set the stage, did you want to say anything now, or shall I play the video first?
Let's start with the video, and then we'll take it from there. And the video will help situate people, and I think they'll be able to follow our discussion better.
Fabulous. Okay, we're going to play this trailer video for the book.
Oxford, 1992. I was from Montreal, and Alex was from Toronto. In Oxford, we were both blank colonial slates, Yanks who bristled at being called Yanks. Having grown up among immigrants, we were fascinated by the suddenly volatile countries in Eastern Europe dominating the news. I must have brushed past Alex half a dozen times before I got to know him, because in what became a fateful triangle, we owed our friendship to an Englishman. We should tell him. Tell him what? That we're his mates? If we're his mates, we should tell him the truth. What truth? Our little prank didn't change a thing. Acts have consequences. Their friendship in tatters, the three young men take separate routes through 1990s Europe. Moscow, Poland, Berlin, Yugoslavia. An interlude of freedom and self-discovery between the Cold War and the stark divisions of the post-9/11 world. I struggled to imagine Alex in a suit in Moscow with a chauffeur. What cloverleaf of fate had spiraled him up to such heights while I scraped by in a basement?
A chauffeur-driven black Range Rover pulled up, and I glimpsed a shadow of the dangerous mafia guy in him. I was frightened. I told myself not to get in the car. It's all right, but he's your friend.
If I wanted to make sure I'm gonna escape, I'd kill you. You could go straight to the police. I'd never do that. You think I haven't ordered people killed before?
I'm Stephen Henighan, and I invite you to immerse yourself in the world of after.
Wow.
I've never had a trailer before, so this is already a big step forward with this book.
Oh, that's really cool. It's very atmospheric. I thought that the pictures were very well chosen. I think it also gives people a flavor of how many different places we travel to in the world of after. Stephen, I wanted to sort of just, the book starts off you've got this protagonist from Canada who moves to Oxford to start graduate studies, but he's inspired by the events of 1989 and the fall of the in the early 90s with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and feeling like things are coming apart. And then we go on to explore other parts of Europe. So there's something really interesting about the lens that you took, because of course we know that you studied at Oxford and you lived in England for a number of years. And I couldn't help but feel, as I was reading it, I felt that there was an aspect of this where there are these deep friendships that form between graduate students who are, when one goes to Oxford, one is already a little bit, as a grad student, you're already apart from everybody else. So you describe that otherness so well, that between the grad students and the undergraduates. And then there's the act of being a foreigner as well. And so, but yet these friendships that form so quickly between the grad students, like it felt a little bit like Brideshead Revisited meets John le Carré. And I thought that was such an interesting mesh, where you have the intrigue and the sort of this European backdrop of not knowing quite what's going to happen, and then these students together as well. So what was your inspiration? Like what inspired you to write this book?
I like the Brideshead Revisited meets John le Carré comparison. And there is an element of that, of course, because Kevin, the protagonist, initially wants to go to Berlin. He sits in Montreal and watches the Berlin Wall fall and sees all these things happening and all these changes, and has this sense that the world he was brought up with no longer exists, the bipolar world of that people took for granted as that world that was the world. And so he wants to go to Berlin, but he doesn't quite have the courage. And this is, I suppose, is one of the keys to his personality and to the attractions that draw him into these friendships you alluded to. Of course, in those situations, friendships quickly become very intense because you're out of your element.
Yes.
And as you signaled, you're doubly or triply out of your element, because it soon becomes clear that Oxford is for undergraduates. and everything works on the undergraduate's routine. And so the graduate students are sort of floating around there, not really quite sure what they're meant to be doing. At the same time, many of them are foreigners, and many of them are cut off from where they've been. They've ended up there as a bit of a surprise. And so they look for meaning in each other, I suppose. And that's this triangle among the three guys that forms is a product of that. So that's the anti-Brideshead version, I suppose.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Yeah, so let's talk a bit about that triangle, because that's so interesting. You've got Kevin the Canadian, who meets another Canadian who he first encounters in England at Oxford, and that's Alex. But Alex is of Russian descent,
yeah.
or actually born in Russia and then
Yeah.
immigrated as a child to Canada.
Well, his father was a defector.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
And then Leon, who's also Russian, but Russian Jewish, born in England,
Yeah.
and so you have these three interesting characters, and it's really what I found interesting about that dynamic between the three of them was that you get this sense that Kevin, your protagonist, it really is drawn to them, and I could at times couldn't figure out if he really genuinely liked these two, or if he just really wanted to belong and to be part of their clique. And so there's this rivalry that you described so well between where they when they pair off with each other. When he's with Leon, he's thinking or talking about Alex, and when he's with Alex, he's like, oh, I'm with Alex now. Leon's not here, so he would be so it felt so real. It felt very much based on probably most people have experienced those kinds of friendship in their adolescence, or in childhood, yes, where you get caught up in these kind of friendship love triangles.
Yeah.
But it was intriguing to me that he experiences this as an adult, and I couldn't quite figure out if he really liked these people or just really wanted their approval, or a bit of both.
I suppose it's an aspect of this being a fish out of water, right? And having lost your context. And we know he's had a very strong context in Montreal. His Montreal life is described, and of course that comes back at various points in the novel. And so that, in a way, infantilizes people to some extent, that they lose their context and their needs become more basic. I think also those sort of friendship triangles that you mentioned, yes, they're very much adolescent, but I think men don't talk about them very much either. And that was one thing I wanted to explore, was how some of those feelings get worked through in a male context, because men don't talk about their friendship jealousies with each other, right? They talk about other things, competitiveness in a certain way, but there's a jealousy there too, and that doesn't get talked about a lot. And I wanted to develop those sorts of feelings a bit, which are often lacking in expression. No.
Yeah, I thought that's an interesting motif through the book. What you just talked about being from Montreal, and there's another thing that resonated for me in reading this book, which was that I remember I arrived in Oxford the year of the referendum. So I was there in 90, and I was very upset because I didn't actually, the paperwork that you had to complete if you were a Canadian living abroad was so complicated, and you needed to send in an original of your birth certificate. I remember I only had the one copy, and I thought, if this thing gets lost in the mail, and they would not accept a facsimile or a printout, and so I had to get it certified. Anyway, long story short, it took weeks for my submission to be sent and processed, and by the time I didn't make it. Let's put it that way.
You didn't get to vote in the referendum.
No, my vote did not get counted, and I felt it was one of the most important elections of my life. Being from Montreal, I felt very passionate about it, and to feel such an outsider about that. And that's one thing you captured very well I thought in the book, was this sense of how important it was to Kevin, and the fact that his German girlfriend at the time, Leonie, just doesn't understand or care, right? She has a very European attitude. Like, I don't want to paint all Europeans with one brush, but I certainly experienced that same sense from some people, that disdain for North America, that sense that
Yes.
North America, it's a young continent, it's got no culture, no history.
Right.
And yet he's drawn. What I found so interesting about Kevin is I don't think he has a single girlfriend through his time in Europe and UK who's from North America. He always
Yeah.
dates foreign women, doesn't
Yeah.
he?
Yeah, and that's part of the that's part of the motif. It's my a writer I don't quote anywhere in this book, and yet who sort of is looming behind it, actually strangely, is Henry James and all of his transatlantic novels. And so there is a bit of that yes, fascination at the same time that there is a constant feeling of outsiderness, and that's. Yeah, of course, Kevin arrives there a bit earlier than you arrived there, because he arrives there in '92, so just after the other series of crises, but the leading, which led up eventually to the referendum. But and that was sort of a challenge. I mean, the book took a lot of imaginative work, in the sense that, in a funny way, I know a lot of people are going to react to this book as though it were a kind of, what would you call it, an autofiction, right? Which is so trendy now, the autofiction or the autobiographical novel. And it's not, actually. And the interesting thing, I wrote a couple of novels in the mid-2010s, which were conspicuously about people who were very, very different from me. And some people liked them, some people didn't. But this one, nobody's going to ask those questions. No, everyone's going to assume I can invent this character. But they may even assume I don't need to invent him, right? Because they assume,
that was what I was going to ask you, actually.
Okay, well, ask away.
Well, I mean, there's so much to say about Kevin, because I find him so I can sympathize with so many of his experiences. But the one that I find most close to my own experience as a Canadian who's lived abroad, in the UK and Australia, is that that sense of always being the outsider looking in. That you're always, especially in older cultures like in Europe, where the minute you open your mouth, you are identified as a foreigner. Your accent places you somewhere, and they don't have that history of constant, multiculturalism and immigration, where people can have different accents and still be local.
Right.
And one of the things that I wanted to ask you was, what draws you to that experience of always of being the outsider looking in, as opposed to writing about your experiences in Canada? And then I also wanted to ask you how much of you is in this character?
And I'm sure you're not the only person who's going to be asking that question, although they may not all ask it aloud. Let me take the second part first, and remind me if I missed the first part. I wanted him to be in Oxford the same years I was there, and then to move on to Eastern Europe, which we'll get to in a bit. At roughly the same time, I had some opportunity to be in those places, and I gave him the same chronology I'd had, but his background is very different in that well, like you and unlike me, he's a native Montrealer, and in fact, one thing I had to do in terms of the imaginative labor of creating this character was, in fact, to imagine his reactions to British society as somebody who was a 5th or 6th generation Canadian. Because when I react to British society, it's very different, because I lived in England as a small child, my mother's English, and so on. So I was always going there on vacations, and I even did a bit of high school in Scotland and so on. So when all of those things that British people say in ironic ways, and North Americans aren't sure whether they're being nice or they're being nasty, I know that they're being nasty, right? But someone like Kevin doesn't. And so I had to filter out some of that, and not make him too good at picking up on vicious British irony and things like that. so that was where a lot of the imaginative work came in, was creating this character. And I wanted him also to be a character who could be involved in a fairly fast moving dramatic narrative, which meant he couldn't be quite as introverted or emotionally contorted or reflective as I am. And so he had to be someone who in some ways was a little bit more straightforward, even at the cost of being a bit blunt and clumsy a lot of the time and blundering into situations. And of course, he couldn't be too much of an academic overachiever, and it couldn't all be too easy for him. And so we see him struggling to finish his thesis and even falling
into he has this fascinating moment of exile too, doesn't he? Because
yes.
you take us from this idyllic, timeless place, you know, like with these college quads and colleges that are hundreds of years old, made of Cotswold stone that shine
right.
in the yellow, in the glowing sunlight. And all of a sudden he gets exiled away for having done something foolish, which is a result of a tragedy that is described in the book and is a sort of a moment clé, you know, like something, a key moment that changes everybody's lives. And he ends up in London, and East London. In fact, I think we have a picture we were going to show, weren't we?
Well, let's show. In fact, I think is there a book cover to start with?
Yeah, let's put the book.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because this is one of the distinctions between this book and my previous book, Blue River and Red Earth, is that in Blue River and Red Earth, and this comes back to the first part of your previous question, Diane, Blue River and Red Earth is very much a book about people on the edge of society, people who are interacting in queasy or uncertain circumstances, people who are outsiders, immigrants, people of mixed background. And there I was writing about a lot of characters who were obviously very different from me. And so one of the differences, I suppose, in writing The World of After was that I knew I would be writing about a character who superficially looked like me and had some of similar cultural traits, I suppose you'd say. So that's one difference. Okay, now we can move on maybe to nice old buildings or something.
Oh yeah, this is a picture.
The Eagle and Child.
This is a famous pub in Oxford,
yes.
which sadly has, after hundreds of years of existence and after being the birthplace of, I think, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis used to meet here as for the Inklings meetings and such.
Yes.
But anyway, this pub has succumbed to the ravages of COVID in the sense that it's gone out of business, and I think it's being sold now. So it's very sad to see. But you have some very pivotal moments. I think the book opens, early on in the book.
Yeah.
There's a party that takes place in the Eagle and Child. And he meets. I think Kevin meets a lot of the people who are going to be important to him throughout the book, right?
Yeah.
In this pub. And I think so much of English social life, traditional English social life, is centered on the community pub.
Right. And of course, the tragedy, which we're not going to describe in too much detail, but which we will allude to in tantalizing ways, the tragedy actually reaches its climax, as it were, in the Eagle and Child also. So the Eagle and Child is an important location in the Oxford part of the novel.
Yes. Hold on, let me just...
I was just going to continue answering the first part of your earlier question, which is why do I always write about these people on the edge and people who are immigrants and outsiders and so on? And I suppose it's obviously because of my own background as somebody who, although nobody really realizes or thinks I'm an immigrant in Canada, I do still sort of feel like one, even though I arrived here at the age of 5. So there is that element, and I've also between my late teens and my late 30s, I lived in a lot of different places and was always the outsider. So I think a lot of what I write is about that experience and about the idea of sort of, at some level, possessing a culture but not belonging to it, which is kind of an unfashionable notion these days, because these days you're supposed to belong to a culture in order to possess it, but sometimes possessing it from the outside, or knowing a lot about a culture and yet not really being part of it, that sort of thing. So
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if you ever felt this way, or if indeed maybe I should ask whether Kevin feels this way, because you're not the same person, as you've
no,
clearly
no, no. I
explained.
was referring more
Yeah,
to
yeah.
this is a consistent theme through
Yes,
several
of
books.
course.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. But I certainly wonder whether people who live abroad find more affinity to their own country and culture when they are abroad, because I certainly never felt more sort of obviously Canadian than when I was living abroad.
Yes.
There are commonalities you find with other Canadians abroad that you perhaps take for granted, and when you're and everyone's in Canada, you see each other's differences far more. And that's something that you mentioned at one point. I think Kevin has a friendship with an upper class Toronto, a woman from
Yes.
um, like I forget the
Rosedale,
name of
I think.
Rosedale.
Yes,
I was going to say
yes, I think it's Rosedale.
the Westmount of Toronto, and I couldn't remember.
Rosedale, yes.
Rosedale, yeah. And you comment is the Kevin mentions in the book that they probably would never have been friends in Canada, but this allegiance that forms from being in the same from the same culture was so true to life. One of the things that I wanted to touch upon before we move away from England and
Yes.
and explore Eastern Europe, because this book is an odyssey, not just to England, but it moves back to Canada and,
Yes.
to the former Yugoslavia and Germany and Poland. But was the experience that Kevin has of being exiled and going to having to live in East in East London,
Yes.
and suddenly from this very idyllic academic life where he can focus on his thesis and wander around on the streets of Oxford and pedal on his bike, he's suddenly having to work a very somewhat banal data entry job, right?
Yes.
And having to make ends meet. What inspired you to take that route? And
well, he had to go somewhere, and
Kevin.
he couldn't go too far away. And I actually lived in East London before it was gentrified, when it was
So we
still.
put a picture up. I think we have a picture of East
Do we have a
London,
picture of
don't
East
we?
London? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. There we go. Yes, that's the East London I lived in. The
So this-
unromantic East London. This is not EastEnders, and it's not the flashy new condos of contemporary East London. So
we
yes.
should just clarify for people who are wondering, this is actually a picture that Stephen took himself. Isn't that right?
It's the view of the front door of my apartment, actually.
Yeah. So in East London, one gets the sense that Kevin finds a more honest life, right? Like there are some of his friends tell him this is how real English people live. This is real England. And I think
Yeah.
Catherine, his girlfriend, the one who is the daughter of the diplomat,
Yeah.
we should explain that Kevin has a lot of different romantic entanglements in this book. It's really
The book does cover quite a few years, of course.
It does. Yeah, it does.
But,
In
yes.
Kevin's defense, I think it covers almost 7 years. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, if you go right to the end, to the epilogue, it covers 12 years. So,
12 years.
yes.
There you
Yes,
go. So he's
right.
allowed. He's allowed to have his romances. But Kevin dates a lovely Japanese lady by the name of Kumiko. He has a few other girlfriends, I think, but he then meets this diplomat's daughter, and I thought Catherine was a really interesting character because she is the daughter of the American ambassador to East Germany, and I think he takes enjoyment in saying that he was the ambassador to an East Germany that didn't exist after the wall fell, right?
That was his first posting
first
at Ambassador
posting.
11. Was to,
and
yes,
then-
I liked including that. Apparently, the U.S. did maintain an embassy in East Germany for 1 year after East Germany ceased to exist, so I couldn't resist
Fascinating.
that.
Yeah. And then he goes on to be posted to Serbia, right?
Yeah.
And she grows up, and I guess he must have had a posting in I remember he had a posting in the Soviet Union, right?
Oh,
Because
there's
she's
several,
grown
I
up-
think.
She grew up in Moscow and in Belgrade.
Yes.
And so she seems someone who's more at home. She's another one of these people who's an
Not
outsider
at home,
looking in,
yes.
isn't she? Because
Yes,
she is
yes.
she's more comfortable in Eastern Europe than she is in the US. And it's not even just anywhere in Europe. She longs for the old ways of communism, which is such an
Yes.
interesting like such a
Yes.
tug of war you've made in this character, because she's proud of the service that they're giving to the
Yes.
US and proud to be an American, and at the same time longing for communism. So where does that come from?
Well, let me start with East London, and then we'll go to Eastern Europe. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
East London is. I mean, I think that's an important sort of reality check for Kevin also, because as for a lot of people, I mean, people come to England, and if the people who do get, you know, scholarships to Oxford and things like that, they end up thinking that that is England. And then you go to East London, you suddenly discover that England is poor, working class, multicultural, and so on, right? And all sorts of things that perhaps had been somewhat obscured. So there's the scene where he suddenly sees A, how high the rents are in East London, and B, he sees job ads and sees how low the salaries are. So that takes a little bit of the romantic shine off the exploration of England, the sort of post-colonial exploration of England, as it were, which is a bit romanticized at the beginning.
And Catherine seems very much at home with him in East London, because she says it reminds her of
yes.
Eastern Europe, doesn't it?
And there is something to that, I think. I think there is a sort of East Berlin aura around East London in the 90s, before it started getting gentrified. That lovely flat that we saw the front door of a moment ago, I rented it, but it was sold for £60,000 shortly after I moved out, and it was apparently 5 years later it was sold for something like £350,000. So it just the whole area became completely unaffordable. So
oh my goodness.
Yes. Catherine is a character who embodies a trait that was quite common in the 90s, which in the novel I use the German term Ostalgie, which is nostalgia for the old East. And I mean, what's a bit weird is having an American suffering from Ostalgie. Because normally the people who suffered from Ostalgie were people who had done well under communism, East Germans or Poles or Hungarians or Russians who had done well under communism, and they wanted the old system back. Or ordinary people who had pensions or subsidies under the old system, and then they were cast out on the tender mercies of the free market and so on, right? And didn't fare well in that. So that Ostalgie becomes part of Kevin's way of exploring or discovering Eastern Europe. And the Eastern Europe he discovers is sort of one where he's highly conscious of the remnants of the world of before, as it were, the world of before 1989. And by contrast, my intention was to try to bring out or draw out exactly what was particular to those first 10 years of the world of after. And of course, this idea of the world before and the world of after in a way works better in German than in English, even, because there is this, in German, this expression, nach dem Wende, after the change. So there is a real sense of afterness, as it were. But anyway, all this leads to various adventures in Poland and Moscow and in Yugoslavia in the aftermath of the war. And a lot of these themes, both on big picture themes, but also the way in which our concepts of those sorts of things impact our individual psychologies and the way we relate to people and the way we think about places and people are also filtered down into the text, I think.
Yeah, I feel like one of the characters we haven't talked a lot about yet, but we have to, is Alex.
Yes.
Because he in a way represents that some of the changes that Alex goes through he's like the personification of the pre-wall, post-wall, or what we as Westerners might think of as the stereotype of the sort of the Soviet world of old and the Russian sort of ultra capitalistic new reality of what capitalism has done to Russia. And I feel like we need to talk a bit about this this character who's
Yeah.
so interesting because he's not easy to like. I find that there are several, these are all, they're fully fleshed out characters in your book who have flaws. Everybody has their flaws, but Alex, it's
Has
interesting.
more.
Yeah, well, it's and I think it might be also my feminine lens on Alex versus, I think I don't want to paint him as being like, he's not a bad guy or anything. He just has um, so many biases at the beginning when
Yeah.
he has very unilateral opinions that he's not afraid to speak categorically about.
Right.
Western literature sucks. Russian literature is the only way to go.
Right.
It's a youthful attitude of youthful certainty that he carries at the beginning of the book. And I think what's interesting is that while all the other characters evolve and grow, and I think the sign of maturity is people growing less certain about life, Alex is always certain in the moment of his beliefs and very pronounced, right?
Yeah.
But he's this Russian literature's passionate about Russian literature, deeply committed to it. He takes this young undergraduate under his wing when they're all still at Oxford and forms a deep connection with this young character, Colin. And Leon, the other part of our friendship triangle, right?
Yes.
Our friendship triangle. Leon and Kevin decide to play a prank, and we won't talk about the outcomes of it, but we'll just say that there's this pivotal moment when I think they're trying to get Alex's attention ultimately, right?
In a way, yes, and that's part of the whole sort of immature jealousy wrapped up in friendship thing, right?
Exactly. And things go wrong, and as a result, there's this Alex's life sort of derails as a result of that, doesn't it? And Leon's life doesn't.
Yes, although in a certain superficially, Alex's life in some ways becomes successful, but he's not being true to himself, because when we meet him, he is someone who has grown up in a very, very Russian environment in the west side of Toronto, and he is, as you say, he lives for Russian poetry, and he knows every Russian poet and what he thinks of them and their strengths and weaknesses and so on. And it's the literary culture that gives him his connection to Russia, and it's that eventually leads him back to Russia. But it's also the literary culture that he ends up betraying at the novel's conclusion. And so he, in a way, exemplifies a certain world of before, in that all his family was able to bring out of Russia when his father defected was their passion for the language and the literature. And but even that in the end becomes compromised, because the only way he can get back to Russia in the 1990s is to become a kind of stockbroker, which inevitably in 1990s Moscow means being involved in a certain amount of shady stuff as well, which then becomes more and more of an issue as time goes on.
It's hard for him to disentangle himself from that world, isn't it?
Yes, and it's a world that's got both a positive and a negative side. Sorry, I'm just looking. There's some
questions.
There are some questions here. Yeah.
So Neil Bessner is asking, could you comment briefly on why you think that autofiction is so popular now? You mentioned this early on. Does it have anything to do you think, with the ways in which we think of fiction now, and imagination and memory?
The answer is yes. No, but thank you very much for that, Neil. I think autofiction is partly a product of the sort of meanness of a lot of our social media, and the way we are always projecting our image on social media, as I am in this moment, and the way you have your Facebook page or your Twitter feed or whatever. And at the same time, I think it's become popular because I think we've learned to, unfortunately, and I hope this passes, but who knows, I think we've learned to trust the imagination a lot less. And we now deconstruct everything and say, well, so-and-so is only saying that because he's from this background or that background. And of course, it has become harder to imagine characters who are different from you, because there are some strictures against that in certain circles. So I think autofiction is one refuge that some writers have taken, where they say, well, if I write about myself, nobody can challenge me on that. I think ultimately, although it's an interesting branch of literature, literature would become awfully barren if that was all we had. And I think the ability to imagine others is what a lot of literature is about. So I hope we do get back to some way of doing that. But I think that autofiction is partly, or the prevalence of autofiction is partly a result of that sort of thing, and that the other refuge perhaps is the historical novel, where people's you're not writing about anybody who's alive today, so people you're allowed to be fictional there too. I would say that the world of after is not autofiction, but it's sort of it's an old-fashioned 19th century realist novel with lots of event and a protagonist searching for his destiny, but somewhat in drag as autofiction.
It's a great description.
Yeah, but yes.
All right, we have another question from Laura. Okay. Laura Gowan. Forgive me, Laura, if I'm mispronouncing your name. You drew a contrast between the world characters of your previous book and this one. What was the writing process for The World of After like compared to your previous novels?
Oh, very interesting. So thank you, Laura. The two previous novels, one was called The Path of the Jaguar, and it's actually about a Mayan woman in a village in Guatemala. And the process of that was I tried to write a different novel because I knew I couldn't possibly write a novel about a Mayan woman. And I tried to write a novel about NGO workers in Guatemala, and two publishers read it. And one of them said to me, the only character who is at all persuasive in here is the Mayan woman. So then I went back and realized that was actually who I knew the most about. And it was very, very hard work, though, to get it right. If I did get it right, I think I got it right because a number of Guatemalan intellectuals have read it in English, as a result of which it's now coming out in Spanish in Guatemala. So if you write about another culture and they actually decide they want to publish the novel in their country, in their language, I think that's probably a good indicator. So that was a very long, difficult process, although it's a short book, of doing something that I knew in a way people would say I shouldn't be doing, but it sort of felt inevitable to do it. And I couldn't write the novel people thought I should be writing because I didn't really know very much about NGO workers. So the other recent novel was called Mr. Singh Among the Fugitives, and that is a flat out satire. There I am writing from the point of view of a character who's very different from me superficially, in the sense that he's a South Asian immigrant to Canada, but it's not meant to be social realism. He's kind of a conceit, and he's a voice that it's a very short novel, and it's a very satirical novel that I use to talk about literary culture in Canada. It's a novel that sort of a small number of people will find intriguing and funny, but will probably mean nothing to a large number of people who are not part of the cultural world in Canada. So there, I didn't really feel the pressure to be realistic or to be persuasive in a certain way. And that one came out very quickly. So I would say that this novel is actually more like the short stories of Blue River and Red Earth, the book whose cover Diane put up earlier, in the sense that although it has a first-person narrator, thank you, although it has a first-person narrator and it's less obviously worked on in the sense of getting into cultures that are not mine, it's still the same process of dealing with the other, the person who's slightly on the edge, the person who doesn't quite fit in, all the contradictions of people who have 2 or 3 cultures colliding with each other and producing 6 or 7 cultural splinterlets, that sort of thing. So
So if I can just add a quick follow-up question to Laura's question, which was a good one, I thought. You go to pains to disguise the name of the to invent a college name in the book for the Oxford College that Kevin attends, which was interesting. It reminded me of Inspector Morse series, where the names are always
obscured,
changed.
Yes, right.
But then there was a charming scene where Kevin and Catherine are in Belgrade at the embassy, and they have to entertain the leaders of the opposition at one point. But you actually used the real
Yeah.
people, and you described them quite well. And I because I didn't know these people on site from my own childhood, it was a bit obscure in my memory. I had to, I was Googling all these people to try to imagine what they looked like. And I was like, oh yeah, he's describing the sideburns and the tweed jacket. It's pretty spot on.
I did meet them all, actually.
I was going to ask you
I did meet them all,
how that felt, because how did you suddenly, it's a work of fiction and all these characters are fictional, but then suddenly you have to pivot and talk about these historical characters.
Yes,
so
and
when did you meet them? What did
I met them in Belgrade. Where else? But but that's part of the, in a way, that's part of the auto-fictional facade, that I've included some people who are reasonably well known under their own names. Another one is a man who is, if there are any French professors listening, they probably know the name Malcolm Bowie, who is a famous scholar of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And Malcolm Bowie is in there under his real name. At one point, Alex and Kevin go and sit in on Malcolm Bowie's seminar for a while. So part of making it seem real, I suppose, a sort of attempt to forge a kind of verisimilitude, was to, in fact, put in a few of these historical characters who are real. So there were a couple of cases where I actually changed identities. There's the visiting Spanish writer who seduces a waiter at the hotel.
Yes, he just disappears with him.
He disappears with him. Yes, right. And he is that is based on a very famous Spanish writer, who actually did that at a dinner I was at. But I changed the name for that one.
Smart.
But I did want to create a kind of an aura of realness, of verisimilitude to try and part of including sort of conversations with opposition leaders and people and people who are relatively well known was I suppose one of the techniques I used for that.
I liked it when they talked about universal health care.
Oh yes,
that was good.
Yeah, that's yes, right.
Yes. So let's get in as many questions as we can.
Yeah.
So we have another one from Emily Whedon.
Okay.
Emily says, "Congrats on the world of after. Love the nuance of a Canadian character being out of the loop on picking up on cruel British irony." And then she writes in brackets, "half British background. I've been the out of the loop person too." A fascinating world with lots of layers and worlds. Looking forward to reading. I always find the question of how much of this is you to be fascinating. I'm a firm believer that authors are authors and characters are characters, and they can share things, but they aren't the same. They aren't the same thing, sorry. I'm a huge fan of invention, and that is the stock in trade of artists. Sorry, I'm rereading this wrong. I'm a huge fan of invention, and that the stock in trade of artists is imagining oneself in another's shoes. Viva fiction. I guess that was not so much a question as a congratulatory
Thank you very much,
comment.
Emily. That's very nice.
That's great.
And it is, yes, I think imagination is always there. And I think actually, even if you write a very autobiographical novel, it's still not an autobiography. They are two different genres. Even the most autobiographical type of fiction, the sort of Rachel Cusk or Knausgaard type of fiction, is still fiction. Okay, do we have other?
Okay, another one.
Questions?
Cheryl Ruddock, very evocative of Oxford. It's rain. But
Thank you, Cheryl.
Wow. Okay, wait, she's calling you out on a particular page here. It says, but on page 107, I traced the camber of her leg with my
Oh, no,
tongue.
no, then why are we reading that?
And then she says, can you explain for those of us who have not been close to Oxford legs where exactly the camber is? Thanks.
Camber refers to a tone, not to a. It's not anatomical, and I believe the person who asked that question is married to a doctor. So
it's actually someone signing as Nick, although it's under
yes,
Cheryl.
he is a physician.
All right. Ah, that's why. It's a cheeky question.
It's a cheeky question.
Got it.
Yes,
Got
it's
it.
a cheeky
Okay.
question. Yes.
I'm going to start scanning these questions ahead of time before I read them.
We'll pass on. We'll pass on the next question
Yes.
from Nick.
Okay, yeah. So, a question from Daniel Garthorpe.
Okay.
Stephen, I've often heard it said that protagonists in fiction can be unlikable, but they must not be irredeemably so, lest they alienate the reader. Do you agree? Have you written any major characters that you felt were on the edge of acceptability for your own readers? And if so, how did you handle it?
Wow, that's a big question. I think that to stay focused on this book, I would say that that Kevin, the narrator, is a character who at times you may despair of a bit because he's a bit of an oaf at times and he doesn't pick up on what's going on around him. But I don't think he's not quite as nasty as an anti-hero. He's not a sort of Duddy Kravitz who you find fascinating because you disagree with him. But on the other hand, I think Alex is a borderline. And I've noticed Diane mentioned this, and she's not the only woman to have mentioned this. Women readers find Alex a bit difficult to handle. I think there's something. He is a very aggressive personality, and there's something a bit threatening about him, which of course makes him fascinating to his male friends.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe slightly chillingly fascinating, but probably makes him intimidating to women and unpleasant to women.
But as I recall, one thing that's interesting is Catherine, Kevin's girlfriend, meets Alex in Moscow at one point and actually says that she was ready to hate him until he spoke Russian, and then his personality changed. And I thought that was a lovely thing that you touched upon in the book, and I think you touch upon it more than once, which is the fact that our personalities do change when we speak different languages. I find that about myself. I'm almost a different version of myself when I speak French, and yet a third version when I speak Spanish. It's almost as if the vocabulary and the way that we craft language influences our behavior to the extent that we can almost become different people when we speak different languages. And is that your experience as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, as you know, I live a lot of my life in Spanish, so I am definitely a different person in Spanish. And I think the interesting thing with the scene you're alluding to is that Catherine says, at first, I don't really understand your friendship with Alex because the part of him that I can see you relating to is the part that's only available in Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I think, indicates some of the tensions and conflicts and sort of yearnings in the friendship, that they can't really connect because Alex in English is this kind of rough guy who never learned English that well and learned it in a bit of a thuggish context. Whereas in Russian, he's a much more refined character who quotes poetry and so on. And that's Catherine can imagine Kevin relating to that Alex. And Kevin, at some sense, senses the existence of that Alex. And there are a couple of scenes where that becomes evident. And yet he can't fully connect with that Alex because he doesn't speak Russian. Yeah. Do we have other questions?
Yeah, we do. So let me get to this one here. There's from Roger Gillett.
Gillett, yes.
Oh, Gillett, I'm sorry.
Roger was at Oxford with me.
Oh, wonderful.
So yes.
Okay. I first want to compliment Stephen on recreating the Oxford of the early 90s. This is a bit of a specific question, but did the anecdote about being kicked out of the Eagle and Child for refusing to reorder a drink actually occur?
It did indeed, and the person who was kicked out with me is now a professor at the University of Waterloo. So yes, and Roger knows who that is, so I don't need to identify them.
That's funny.
So
I must admit, I've never fully been kicked out of an Oxford pub for not drinking, but I have had filthy looks for nursing a half pint all evening.
all evening, yes, I can imagine.
Oh my goodness. I think for the time being, I think
Have we caught up?
we've caught up to the extent that I am catching the Q&A portion. I think we're good. But I know
Okay.
Chantel is
There are a
diligently.
few more on the there. Oh, there's some more on the chat, I think.
Well, she's copying them over.
Oh,
into
Chantel's
Q&A,
copying them
and
to the
and
chat.
I think she's diligently distinguishing between comments and questions. So,
Yes.
although, yeah. So,
Okay, well,
so
Margot-
unless if you want me to, I'm happy to read the comments out loud as well. but-
I'm just going to answer to respond to Margot Irvine's comment about.
So maybe I'll read it out loud.
Yeah,
Just
okay,
in case,
read it
in
out.
case this is being recorded and people won't have the
Yes,
text
of
in
course,
front
of course.
them.
I'm
So
sorry.
I'll read it out loud. That's
Yes,
fine.
that's a good idea.
From Margot Irvine, congratulations on the book, Stephen. Just a comment. I really enjoyed the pop cultural references to the 1990s and the uses of email as a new medium in the book.
One thing, yes, because the book runs from about 1992 to, well, right to the end, it goes to, if you include the epilogue, it goes to 2004. I had to be very careful about how people were able to communicate at all of these stages.
Mhm.
And in fact, 1992-93, most students did not have email. By 93-94, most of them did have email. So in a sense, because the three central male characters are only together at Oxford for 1 year, they actually never start emailing each other, which dramatically turned out to be much better because that means they can't be constantly in contact.
Yes.
And if they had been emailing each other, I think a lot of the tension would have drained out of the story. And
I love the fact that we got to read these lovely letters.
Yes, they actually write. People actually still write letters in the novel. I know, but then of course when he meets Leonie, the German woman whom he dates for a while in Poland, she writes down her email address, and he says, "What is this code she has given me?" And so then you begin to see things. And I deliberately use slightly antiquated language when he's traveling down the coast of Croatia on his way to Bosnia, where another key event happens that sort of mirrors the calamity in the first half of the novel. There's another calamity that occurs in the second half of the novel in Bosnia. The driver is talking on what we would now call a cell phone, although it's a very primitive version because it's about 1995, 96, 97 maybe.
Yes.
And he actually says,
Did you call it a portable or something?
Yes, I call it a portable telephone.
Yeah.
And that when I was living in East London, that was what people called them.
Yes.
In the late 90s. So I thought I'll use the vocabulary from the time, even though it sounds sort of quaint today.
And did you keep diaries throughout your stay in England? Like, how did you remember your own nomenclature for these things? Because now in England they call them mobiles, for example.
Yes,
so
right.
How did you even remember that? I'm not sure I would have remembered.
I just remembered it from East London and from the first people in my neighborhood in East London who began to get them. But no, I have no diaries from England. Whenever I travel, I write huge diaries. I mean, often 4 or 5 pages a day. And so a lot of the Bosnia stuff comes from that, for example.
Yes.
That's why that's very detailed. Also,
yes, you did a really good job of evoking the differences. He crosses from Croatia to Bosnia, and it's dramatic how different, like even the scene, I think, across a single river, you get the sense of crossing into this completely different world.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's and of course at the end of the novel he finally gets to where he hoped he would be able to go at the beginning, which is Berlin. He finally arrives at the epicenter of this world of after, in the sense that it's where the Holy Grail, where the Berlin Wall fell. Except what happens there and what he's doing there is not at all what he'd imagined because of all that's happened in the previous years. So we won't spoil the ending for anyone, but that's where we end up in the novel.
Yes, you're getting a lot of lovely comments congratulating you.
Oh, thank you.
In the chat, Stephen.
I have seen a couple of messages from people.
There's a question.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, I've seen a couple of messages. I just saw a message from somebody who was a friend and political fellow activist of mine in my undergrad decades ago. So thank you, Michelle. I haven't
wonderful.
spoken to Michelle in years, but we will catch up soon.
Great.
So,
Well, we have one more question, and I'm reminded by Chantal that we're nearing the end of the event, but I
Okay.
think we have time for this. It would be lovely to make time for this question by Tamas Doboji.
yes.
Again, apologies if I mispronounced
Yes.
that. There was a sense at the end of the 1980s and start of the 1990s in parts of Eastern Europe that communism had lost, quote unquote, and capitalism had won. And that this was echoed to some degree in some of the cultural criticism of the time. Did this come into play at all in your writing of the novel? And how does that look to you now in retrospect?
Wow. It's true probably that a lot of, I mean, Thomas would know a lot about this. Thomas has written 3 or 4 short story collections set in Hungary or about Hungarian Canadians. And so he probably has a clearer sense of this than I do. But yes, there probably was a sense even before the wall fell that communism had lost. And yet once it disappeared, people began to regret in regret the loss of their pensions and their maternity leaves and so on. And yet there was also, I mean, how does it look now? Oh boy, we've been through I mean, the frightening thing now, I think, is that, because communism failed, capitalism has failed for all but a minority. And so in places like Hungary and Poland, what do we see? We see a return to a kind of brutish ethno-nationalism, which I think that's, it's not an original analysis, but I think that's where I would end up.
I mean, and one of the other things you mentioned, what people missed from the communist era, one of the other things I think, and you touch upon in the book, was the sense that people looked out for each other more.
Yes. That's true. That comes out in the book. Yeah, that there is that sense of people of community, really, and people got atomized by the fall of the wall and the introduction of a particularly savage form of capitalism, where it was actually seen as you weren't being a good capitalist unless you bilked people. There was a very strong sense of, it wasn't a question of competition evening out prices and all that. It was a question of, can I get $300 a night for this hotel room? I'll get $300 a night for this hotel room, even if it's a shoddy old hotel room, that kind of thing. And so that, of course, then discredited the new system as well as the old, and we're left with ethno-nationalism, I guess. But yeah. But. Yes.
Well, let me just read to you, Stephen, because I don't know if you're tracking comments. I think we're done with the Q&A, but there's a lovely comment from someone called Laser Lederhandler,
who has just been nominated for the Governor General's Award for French to English literary translation.
Congratulations, Laser. Yes. That's wonderful, Laser. Okay, so first, Laser says, congratulations, Stephen. Fascinating discussion. I very much look forward to reading The World of After, which I'm embarrassed to admit will be my introduction to your writing. I hope we can finally get together in the not distant future. Take care, Laser.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you very much, Laser. I worked with Laser for many years on a number of translations that he did, which including one incredibly long one that hasn't come out yet, which we're all looking forward to. So, yes.
Well, translation is a fine art in and of itself.
Yes.
And I'm very impressed. I knew that you translated from Spanish and Portuguese into English. I did not know that you did Romanian. That's impressive.
Yes.
So I think I'm going to hand. Unless is there anything else you wanted to?
No, what I probably want to do is thank you, because it wouldn't have been this conversation wouldn't have been the same without you, Diane. So thank you very much.
Well, Stephen, I was very touched and honored when you asked me to do this, and also a little bit nervous. I think the first thing I said to Stephen, I was like, "Hey, Stephen, I am not Eleanor Wachtel. I'm not even Sheila Rogers. I am I'm not a literary critic or even a book interviewer." So I was very reticent. But when Stephen told me, let's just have a conversation, read the book, and let's chat, I said, okay, I could do that. I could do that.
Well, thank you so much for doing it.
Well, it's my great pleasure, and and congratulations on a terrific book. I think the correct word in tongue in cheek is that it is unputdownable.
Thank you.
This is, but it took me, you know, at first I was sort of reading it like, yeah, I've got to get through. I calculated how many pages I needed to read per day in order to, because I received the book about 10 days ago, and I've been busy with other things. So I was like, okay, got to get 50 pages a day and I'll be done. And I soon found myself just reading late into the night, not even
That's
caring
great.
when I was, yeah, it was
Thanks so
very,
much.
very good. So I hand things over now. Thank you very much, Stephen. And I'm handing things back to Stephanie now.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much, Stephen and Diane, for such an engaging evening. Thank you to everyone who joined and participated, asking questions and just tuning in. On behalf of the bookshelf, I'd like to thank Mark Cote of Cormorant Books and Stephen for sharing this with us. And just a reminder that if anyone is interested in picking up a copy of The World of After, we have signed copies signed by Stephen for sale, and you can certainly give us a call or try us on our website, bookshelf.ca, to order online until we are open to the public again. So thanks again for a lovely evening. Good evening.
Okay.